We've all heard it said, words have power. Our guest can lend some insights into exactly what that means. Jeanette Castillo is an associate professor of digital media at Florida State University in Tallahassee with particular interest in political communication. Jeanette received her PhD in mass communications from Indiana University with a dissertation entitled, get this, Agnostic Democracy and the Narrative Distempered Elites, an analysis of citizen discourse on political message forums. Jeanette Castillo blends the scholarly and creative in everything she does, producing documentary and narrative videos and writing for various media in an effort to both enlighten and entertain. She inspires her students to follow their passions toward creativity with a purpose. Before joining the faculty of Florida State University in 2007, Dr. Castillo wrote lyrics for the song Christmas in Whoville for the movie Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, starring Jim Carrey, which landed her on the red carpet at the movie's premiere. She's produced a number of documentaries that highlight the better side of humanity and what is being done to help others be the best possible human beings they can. Dr. Jeanette Castillo, welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Thank you very much, Brent. What a wonderful introduction.
Well, you've got a wonderful history here. First question is doctor or professor your preference? I mean, I'm never sure which is the more prestigious.
Oh, I don't really dwell on that too much. Whichever one feels comfortable or comes out of your mouth first is fine with me.
How about Jeanette?
That would be perfect.
Great. I love it. Now, first off, I want you to understand my history is in the theater. So I'm a theater person first and foremost, way before I was a radio broadcaster. So I just am curious. First off, you wrote Christmas in Whoville.
Yes.
I'm trying to recall which song that is. Any chance I could put you on the spot and ask for a few bars?
Oh, boy. Well, I actually got into the movie through winning a contest. And they put out a call. It was Carol Bayer Sager and David Foster and another guy named Steve Pippner who wrote the track. And they put up a contest online to write lyrics. And, you know, as a kid, The Grinch was the one show I waited on. I'm old enough that you had to be sitting in front of the TV when it came on, you know. And so Ron Howard picked my lyrics, and my song is only in there for about 10 seconds, but it was enough to ensure that my name rolls by as the people are sweeping up the popcorn in the theater.
I think that's terrific. What was it like attending a Hollywood premiere? Did you have occasion, by the way, to meet Jim Carrey or anyone else from the cast?
They actually have preferred seating in the premiere theater. So I did meet people from the cast, though. We went to the premiere, and we got to go to the party afterwards, and it was quite fun.
Yeah, did Jim Carrey make a scene at the party or anything?
I didn't see him make a scene.
Oh, no. I mean, he's a very, very funny performer. I'm just intrigued as to whether or not he's like that in real life. I
would have loved to have seen that. He didn't grace us with his presence while I was there.
Oh, well.
Yeah, darn.
Well, that's terrific. Okay, we've gotten the preliminaries out of the way. You'll have to forgive me, but it's as a show person, I love to get into this kind of stuff. Let me ask you to start off, what exactly is meant by the term political communication?
Well, I would think that it's any kind of communication that is intended to sort of further the project of government or politics. So it could involve any type of communication, whether it's coming from the top down or the bottom up, that has a political intent.
Now, how did that become your interest? I mean, you were pursuing media. Mass
yes.
communications. And how did you end up into the direction of political communication?
Well, you know, I started out as a fiction writer and in my undergraduate days, and political communication to me is it's another form of storytelling. But it's a form of storytelling that actually has some real life implications. I think what interests me about political communication is that I've always been a big fan of democracy. And ever since I was a kid, like I mentioned, Nixon, McGovern, I remember being aware that we were able to govern ourselves by this contest of ideas as expressed in words, and that the person who sort of outlined the best idea for how we should govern ourselves would win this competition. And I was always just sort of enamored with that idea. And the term in my dissertation is actually agonistic democracy, which means that it stands sort of in opposition to an antagonistic form of democracy, right? So that we...
Oh, and I had it down as agnostic. Agonistic.
Yes, agonistic.
Thank you for the correction.
That's okay. What I was seeing as I was watching people on both sides of the political spectrum talk online is that none of them felt like they were being well represented. And agonistic actually refers to the fact that, you know, when we sign on to democracy, we basically sign a contract agreeing that we will be disillusioned. You know what I'm saying? We're going to lose at some point when we sign on to a competitive system.
Well, I mean, and first off, I have a commitment to my listeners and to myself. I never let anybody get away with just using the D word on my show without making a comment.
Okay.
And in this case, the D word being democracy, because democracy is majority rule, which means the minority has no say. In the United States of America, we were established as a republic in which everybody has rights, and 99% of the people cannot vote away those rights. So democracy inherently is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. It's not necessarily a good thing.
I refer to democracy as sort of the competitive battle of ideas, and whether the actual structure turns out to be representative government in the form of a republic, what I'm really talking about is that commitment to engage in a battle of ideas.
Super, excellent. Now wait, let me expand on the political communication issue, because then I want to actually ask you something else about media in relation to that. But first, when we talk political communication, are we talking what you and I are doing, like we're talking politics, or the family talking politics, or are we talking about mass communication, okay, on a political scale, or do both qualify?
It's all of the above, yes.
It is all of the above. Okay.
Yes.
Then we go to the media question. Are media and politics irrevocably entwined, or are they actually separate entities?
I think they're pretty irrevocably entwined, and I think they always have been, right from the time of Thomas Paine. We couldn't have had the American Revolution without the printing press, right? And so the British government wanted to ban the printing presses from being imported into the United States because they knew that once people had the power to speak to large numbers of people via a mass medium, that there could be trouble. So it can be a tool of control, or it can be a tool of resistance.
Well, and there you go, exactly. That it's a tool, and it can be used for good, and it can be used for ill. And it seems like, the cycle has moved from one to the other these days when we look at media and how much corporate influence there is over it. You wrote this dissertation, and I'm going to get it right this time, Agonistic Democracy and the Narrative Distempered Elites, an Analysis of Citizen Discourse on Political Message Forums. What exactly was all that about?
Well, I went in search of something called the comic corrective. That is that there is a literary critic who says the proper attitude toward history is the tragic with a comic corrective, and that means that we are basically agreeing to those agonistic terms. That is, we don't fight our political battles to the death, right? We take them to election. And I was interested in what ordinary people were doing online. I saw the internet as this place where a lot of ordinary people who might not have talked about politics before were engaging in discussion of politics. And I wanted to see what they were saying and what type of attitudes toward history they were expressing, because I think we're inundated with the rhetoric of the elite via the media, and the media very rarely talks to ordinary people and asks them what they think. They're basically shut out. So it was sort of my my way of trying to amplify those voices of those regular citizens who wanted to have some input.
And just a slight correction, what media will tend to do is they'll tend to talk to all of the ordinary people, and they'll end up on the editing room floor.
Right, yes.
But that way they can say, well, we did talk to them.
We did, yes. I think you're right there.
Now, it has been. Oh, now wait. What did you find? What did you find with looking into what what people on the internet were saying about these issues? What did you have any conclusions? Did you see any patterns?
Yes, I did. I saw. Well, first of all, one of the things that's interesting is that most of these people who participate in political forums are they're starting their discussions with mainstream media articles and stories anyway. So there's the first thing that I found is that by far, and the conservative message board was very, they were more so likely to use mainstream media sources and less likely to write opinions themselves. I found that citizens on both sides were just very unhappy with those that supposedly represented them. So, in other words, the people on the left didn't feel like the Democrats were really representing them, and the people on the right didn't feel that the Republicans were really representing them. And yet, this sort of disgruntlement among the population is portrayed by the elites as being a sort of sign of unfitness, for self-governance. And so, people will say, oh, the mob or they're kind of the unwashed masses. And what I find is that they're quite thoughtful and passionate, and certainly, I think, capable of self-government. So it was, all of my findings supported that these people were carefully reading and thinking about their positions. And as long as they sort of kept their discussions to the level of policy and ideology, that they were doing a good job. And that's basically what I...
Well, that implies that there was a point beyond which they were not doing a good job. Did they go beyond policy into an area that you considered inappropriate?
Yes. I mean, I was looking at this literary critic who I mentioned uses poetic frame. So there's the heroic frame, right, which is a story about a person who does the right thing for the right reason. There's tragic frames, and then there's burlesque. And some of these frames that involve name calling and a turn to something that is beyond our sort of earthly matters, if you know what I mean. That is, when you invoke a sort of a cosmic force in your political discourse, you are sort of taking it to a level that makes it difficult to have that debate, because you can't really argue with a prayer. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And so it was it was least successful when people were sort of invoking God as being on their side, because that just really doesn't allow for a back and forth.
Well, let me ask you this. Did people are complaining about not having good representation? Did you find there was any amount of chatter about, I don't need no stinking representation, I can take care of myself? Or was it just, I can't find a good representative to do these things for me?
Well, I think that there were certainly people, my conclusion was that I'm a big fan of democracy, so that means I think there should be two sides to every conversation. And in my opinion, my conclusion was that it worked best when you were sort of having a discussion between the libertarians and what I'll call communitarians. That is, people who would be the left, who think that there is a collective responsibility and a collective role for government to be a part of people's lives, and the libertarians who argue for individual rights and responsibilities. And so my conclusion was that a continuing conversation between those two groups was sort of the productive way to go, that whatever we come to in between that is probably going to suit most people. very
good.
well.
Very good. Now, it's been well said that words have power, but I don't think most people realize how true that is. And political wordsmiths continue to streamline their craft. They use select words and phrases to influence public sentiment and thereby move the country in whatever directions they want.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of this is very recently, and actually as far back as Bush, I guess, Obama and Bush officials have used the phrase federal family with increasing frequency as a replacement for the word government. And, you know, what do you have to say about this tactic? And can you give some examples of this strategy being used, this being employed?
Yeah, I mean, it's classic propaganda, right? It's propaganda actually goes back to the Catholic Church, and this is the federal family is a particularly silly example of propaganda. I mean, it's just absurd, and I think it is really sort of an illustration of how out of touch with the public people in government tend to be. You know, nobody's going to confuse the government with their family, and vice versa.
Oh, but it has some kind of a psychological impact. When you hear the word family,
yes,
it sounds
to make you feel warm and fuzzy.
Government.
Of course, which presumes that everyone feels warm and fuzzy about their family, which may not necessarily be the case. It's like, oh no, mean old Grandma Millie's coming to help me. It's freedom fries. It's all of those things that have classically been used. And I think what people do is they hear the words and then they have to ask themselves a question about what's motivating it and what is the intended purpose of it. So it can seem fairly harmless, although it's not really productive. But then the question becomes, is it intended to deceive people? Or, as you say, manipulate people into supporting something that is probably not in their best interest.
Or not supporting something that is, exactly.
Yes.
And some of the more subtle examples are things like the word homeland.
Yes.
Homeland, for example, gets its roots from Hitler's Germany. And we never had that word. You know, a dozen years ago, we never used that. Suddenly we have Homeland Security, Homeland this, Homeland that. Another one that I've noticed, and I'm curious if you would agree with me that this is an example of it. There's a pattern, and if you look at a story, any story in the news, and they talk about a country with which we are allied, our country or countries that the U.S. is allied with, there are always administrations, the Obama administration, the David Cameron administration, the Sarkozy administration. If we're talking about countries with which we are belligerent, where we are not happy, they are regimes. The Iraqi regime, the Libyan regime. Am I imagining that?
No, that's an excellent example. I mean, that's an excellent example of making a distinction, right? To make them the other, to make them not us, not of us, right? So we just come up with two different terms. But a lot of politics is about that, right? Sort of just determining who's in and who's out. And I met a really eminent political scientist at one point in my graduate school career, and he told me that a Native American woman told him this: "It's me against my brother. It's me and my brother against my cousin. It's me and my brother and my cousin against the other family. It's our two families against the other tribe," and so on, right? So pulling that whole regime administration thing is just a way of saying they're not in our tribe.
Well,
they're not one of us.
In a very real sense, it's kind of like variations on a theme, divide and conquer. I mean, all of these distinctions serve to divide, put everybody into a little cubicle and then tell people don't trust anybody who's not like you.
And I would say the other danger of this, the sort of misuse of words and political communication that way, is also the danger of sort of debunking a word, that is sort of rendering it meaningless in a way, like, for example, the word war. So we have a war used to mean something very specific, and now we have a war on drugs, and we have a war on poverty, and we have a war on terror, which is, you know, a kind of a concept, not So we're talking about now having wars against inanimate objects and concepts and things like that, whereas war had always previously been understood to be waged against people and other nations. And so it sort of disguises the fact that the war on drugs, for example, is actually a war on people who use drugs and people who sell drugs. And then the word war sort of becomes meaningless. Yes,
exactly. I completely agree. And it is a tactic there that Bill of Rights was something special. Today, everything is a Bill of Rights. You have a child's Bill of Rights, an airplane passenger's Bill of Rights, so this Bill of Rights, that's Bill of Rights, which in some way cheapens what Bill of Rights means. Same thing, war on terror, war on poverty, war on such and such. And,
right.
There is some way in which that has a subtle effect on the overall population. It can't be for the good.
No. I think that's, and I think people are aware of it. And I want to say that one thing, another interest of mine is in comedy and the role that comedy plays in political communication. And this is the way that we debunk the propaganda. That is, the regular people on the ground have always ridiculed those types of messages when they come from government. And they basically debunk them for each other. There's a great book out recently about Hitler, and during Hitler's time in Germany, people couldn't stop making Hitler jokes, even though he killed them. And I recently met with an Iraqi scholar, and he was telling me the same thing about Saddam Hussein, that people couldn't stop making jokes about Saddam Hussein, even though they were under threat of execution. So I think that one of the ways that people sort of fight back, and it's not so obvious because we don't see it, it happens in people's homes and in their workplaces, is that they debunk this political rhetoric from the elites by ridiculing it and mocking it.
Well, now, that raises a question. Would you consider this wordsmithing, which is my word for it, but this use of words to politically manipulate masses, would you consider that a form of mass hypnosis?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's, I think when most people hear it, I have more faith in people than to believe that they are capable of being hypnotized. I believe they can be misled. I believe that they can even be perhaps deceived for a certain period of time, fool some of the people some of the time. But I don't believe that in the modern era, particularly when we have sort of back channels of communication, in an era of nothing but mass media. So if you look at North Korea, where people get nothing but government-sponsored messages, then I think that's a danger. But as long as we have channels through which we can talk to each other, I think we're a little safer from that kind of a mass hypnosis effect.
How do you suggest individuals and groups of people resist the unseen influences of this, because they're very powerful, like we've just been talking about?
Right. I think people have to pay attention, and they have to get involved, and they have to ask themselves when they hear this kind of language. The government puts out all kinds of propaganda, and we hear a message about don't throw your lit cigarette into a national forest. We can say, okay, what's the motivation behind that? Well, we don't want a forest fire. But when we hear something like war on drugs, we have to ask ourselves, what is the motivation behind calling everything terrorism, for example, or using a term like the war on drugs? We have to be more critical thinkers and consumers of this language. And as I think I heard you mention in one of your intros, this sort of who's the messenger? For example, MSNBC, which is generally seen as this very progressive left-wing network, is, of course, owned by General Electric. And what have we heard about the nuclear disaster in Japan? Well,
Nothing.
we can't expect that General Electric-owned media are going to tell us that a General Electric-owned plant in Japan is still leaking radiation. They may not make up lies about it, but it's omission, right? They they're not going to discuss it. And so people need to get informed. People need to ask those questions and really dig into who's behind the sources of the news that they read.
And do you have any suggestions to people who want to get, learn more about these types of topics and techniques and your work as well?
They can certainly, anyone could email me, but reading,
Well, we're out of time. I tell you what, I'm going to give out the website up at the FSU website.
Okay,
you can
great.
find more about you. My guest has been Dr. Professor Jeanette Castillo from Florida State University. www.comm.cci.fsu.edu. We'll put it up on our website as a link. Thanks so much, Jeanette. God bless you, and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.